Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 18th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. That's because I rely on the support of individuals just like you to offset those costs of production. So for anybody who can't afford to pay, I want to make sure that you never have to. And I want to thank the incredible people who make that possible each week. So the top patrons this week include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Riva Keith, and Ulrika Hagman. And maybe I should say, too, sort of the top patrons of all time, really. So I'm going to change some of my search parameters here. And I'm going to look at lifetime contributions to the show. And they really include, I'll probably be repeating some people here, but David J.E. Smith, Brian Holden, Daniel Lang, Gabrielle Jaramillo, Jeff Sewell, Rob Schreck, Charles Payette, Juan Navarro, David Compton, Charles Bleal, Phil Tiber, Juan Gutierrez, again, Pasquale Gelati, The Honorable Husband, and Ken Pfeiffer. Gosh, thank you guys so much. You keep Talk Nerdy going. You keep the editor and my incredible assistant, Noelle, and just, me able to afford to keep doing this week after week, coming up on 10 years and 500 episodes. I can't believe it. All right, so we have a really incredible episode for you this week. This is a topic that is just fascinating and in many ways near and dear to my heart. So I had the opportunity to interview two sociologists who co-wrote a book called The Unclaimed: Abandonment and Hope in the City of Angels. So here comes an interview with Doctors Pamela Prickett and Dr. Stefan Timmermans. So Dr. Prickett is a sociologist who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam. She has two books out, and she previously, before she got into sociology, worked as a writer, a broadcaster, a producer, and sort of continues some of that work along with her academic investigations. Dr. Stefan Timmermans, he's a professor of sociology at UCLA, and he's written several books, oftentimes around death investigations, forensic death investigations, and also qualitative research, which kind of goes hand in hand with the book that they've co-written together. This is a trade publication, not an academic publication, so it is written for a more general audience. It's narrative nonfiction. It's really, really compelling. And again, the book is The Unclaimed: Abandonment and Hope in the City of Angels by Dr. Pamela Prickett and Dr. Stefan Timmermans. So without any further ado, here they are. Well, Stefan and Pamela, thank you so much for taking some time with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Pleasure to be with you.
I am really excited because when your book came across my desk, there are certain topics that I'm quite interested in, quite passionate about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of where I'm coming from right at the top of the show, I think, because that will help both for the listeners who kind of know me and know the show, and for you guys, like sort of what that frame is or that perspective. I am a newly minted clinical psychologist, but my interest in areas of kind of expertise are in existential psychotherapy, end of life, death and dying, and cancer and heart failure. And I just finished my dissertation on medical aid in dying. And so I actually approach a lot of these questions or these topics that are grappled with, from a psych perspective more than a sociological perspective, but there's so much crossover there. And B, I often am working with people as they are getting ready to kind of leave this earth, as opposed to some of these really interesting questions about what happens after the fact. And so that may be, I just want to prime you because that may be where some of my questions are coming from. But I'm super, super excited to talk about this because I can tell you right now, I watch documentaries at a fever pitch. I read a lot of nonfiction, and I have never come across this topic. And so, okay, here it is. Let's dive in. The Unclaimed: Abandonment and Hope in the City of Angels. I'm also here in Los Angeles, so this is very near and dear to my heart as well. You two are both sociologists, yes? But at different universities. You've just worked together for a long time. So before we get into the topic, why don't you tell me each about your background? Like, how did you get into sociology, and what do you tend to focus your research on?
Yeah, well, I love that question. So it helps kind of ground everything that each one of us is about to say from here on out, right? So I sort of, I'll be honest, I kind of fell into sociology. I didn't really know what I was getting into entirely when I started my PhD. I had a journalism background. I had worked in television and broadcasting for a while, and I knew that I wanted to do deep stories, do ethnography. I wanted the length of time that academic research allows, that journalists on daily deadlines or multiple days, multiple shows a day don't have time for. So that's kind of why I got into doing academic research and leaving journalism. And sociology just became this great place to address all my varied interests. So I have a lot of questions I'm interested in. And I've looked at religion, I've looked at health, I've looked obviously at death and dying. But one thing that I think is consistent among all my research and why I love sociology is kind of getting at notions of how do we balance individualism and community? So we have this really, kind of biological human need to be with others, to be social creatures. But at the same time, especially in America, right, we have this dedication to our individual freedom and self. And so I'm kind of really interested in moments when this conflict becomes very consequential for any number of reasons. And so that's obviously why I think The Unclaimed and thinking about, what does it mean if you don't have community at the end of life, what that looks like was just a really powerful topic for me to dive into.
That's fascinating. And I must say, very existential. And
yeah, exactly.
And Stefan, before you dive in, I also have to say, Pamela, I feel like there's so many interesting parallels between us. Like, I too worked as a journalist and a television host for many, many years after my neuroscience kind of entree into academics. And that's why I only just finished my PhD just before I turned 40, because I went back to school to kind of do a career shift in many ways for very similar reasons. So that's just, wow, fascinating.
I love it. I love it.
I know, it's so random. I love it.
Yeah.
All right. So Stefan, tell me where are you right now in the world? And, how did you get to kind of study what you study, and what are your areas of focus?
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you on finishing the PhD.
Oh, thanks.
That's. I hope you celebrated that. We have to celebrate all the wins in academia.
That's true. It's a long haul.
Yes, exactly. I know about that. So I'm actually in Los Angeles right now. I'm a professor at UCLA, and I've always been fascinated with bad debts. So in contemporary society, we have an understanding of what good dying is all about, and it's influenced by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the idea of sitting next to the bedside and being comfortable, respecting the wishes of the individual patient and the family members, and saying goodbyes and sort of wrapping up life. So I'm interested in the deaths that fall outside that script, the violent deaths, the sudden deaths, the unexpected deaths. And so the unclaimed fits into this broader kind of narrative, because these are people who die, and at this critical moment when they're deceased, their relatives are either unable or unwilling to bury them. And so that poses a lot of questions about how did you get to that point, because nobody grows up thinking, I want to go unclaimed when I grow up. So there's something happened in their life that they get at this particular point, and so that's how I came to this particular topic. I've done research in medical examiners' offices. I've done research on resuscitation technologies, and so this is sort of a next installment in that fascination of how do we make sense as a community, as a society, of deaths that are bad.
It's interesting. I when I read the sort of description, the top matter, like the way that your book is pitched by the publishers, one of the things that I really liked was the careful choice in wording around describing deaths, because I do think that often we have this binary, or I'm looking at my bookshelf behind me, and I have, just like shelves and shelves about how we die. And a lot of them are, the good death, or how to have a good death. And I have started moving into using the words like authentic death as opposed to good death, because I don't want to place a value judgment and say, this is how you're supposed to die. I want to know from my patients, what is it that they want, and how can we empower them to die the way that feels the most true to them. But what's interesting is this idea of the after the fact, right? Because I work with people who are often dying somewhat slowly, and they know it's coming. And so planning and engaging is a huge part of our work. But some of the individuals that you are discussing, and definitely the people who you've researched in the past, violent deaths, for example, or accidental deaths, they don't have that privilege. And so I'm curious about sort of your take or your interest in both. Like, have you done a lot of research in people who know that they're going to die versus people who, you're only coming to the scene after the fact?
I mean, most of the research is on people who die slowly, who have these, cancer death, HIV deaths, people who have time to prepare, what's interesting about it, it also lends itself to doing research on death and dying. How do
Yeah,
you
exactly.
study somebody
It is a video.
who dies,
That's true.
dies suddenly? It's very difficult to get at that. And so once you think about it that way, you can see how hospice, palliative care, preparing for dying, it's to some extent a bit of a luxury situation.
Oh, yeah.
There's an
Mhm.
opportunity to get to this, but many people don't get this luxury, and their relatives still have to grapple with what does this death mean, and there still need to be arrangement. And if there's nobody there to make arrangements, like who takes care of these bodies? Like you cannot just leave them in the street. So um, I know a lot about that literature of hospice dying and palliative care and end of life preparations, but there's a little bit of a bias into this, a selection
Yeah.
bias. These are the deaths that are institutionally in advance defined as terminally likely to go to end up dead. And so the question is, what happens to the other deaths?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I can't help but ask, I know, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself and getting a little bit specific, but the laws, we see these historical examples of places where social justice is breached. Uh, in examples of, like, let's say states or countries where LGBTQI rights are not affirmed, and so somebody will die, but their partner is not seen as family or is not seen as kin, and they don't have many rights. I can imagine that there are a lot of people in this world who maybe don't have family, but have small community. Like, let's say somebody who's living unhoused in Skid Row and they don't know their family, or they have lost their family, but they have, neighbors and friends who live nearby who don't really have many legal rights. How does that work when it comes to the unclaimed? Can somebody who's not legally related to you claim you?
Yeah, that is such a good question. And I'll be honest, like this is one of the areas of surprise for me when we came into this research, and what I sort of thought in my head was probably normal at this point in time. and what we discovered. So I'll just back up very quickly and say my very concrete way of coming into the Unclaimed was that I was doing my dissertation research at a mosque in South Central Los Angeles for many, many years. And I knew a woman through that community. She'd been a member of the community for decades. They call women sisters and men brothers. So Sister Sherry had been a member for a very long time. And she had a lot of health struggles, a lot of housing struggles, addictions, mental health issues. So she was estranged from her family of origin, and she really counted on this Muslim community for her social support. She passed, and I was sitting in the prayer hall one year during Ramadan when the head imam got up and said, Sister Sherry has passed, and she is on the verge of going unclaimed. She'll be cremated by the County of Los Angeles. We need to rally together to raise funds to go to court to fight for the right to claim her body. And then they did, and they were able to give her a funeral in line with their religious traditions. And I just so I came into this thinking, oh, okay, this is what happens, right? If maybe you don't have family, you might be able to have a local community or friends claim you. Turns out that's exceptionally rare. In Los Angeles County, what we discovered, we looked at about 600 cases in depth. While we talk about really focused on 4 individuals in the book, we did look at over 600 cases. And, this just only happened maybe 2 or 3 times in those 600 cases.
Wow, really? And so is that because, you mentioned that the imam was like, we have to rally together, we have to go to court, we have to fight for this. So clearly there's no easy path. Is that because of those barriers, or is it because it's just people aren't even often trying?
Yeah, well, so the law is quite strict in California. There's a sort of, it's strict and it's also open for interpretation, right? As the law so often is.
As many laws are.
Yeah. So there's this idea of who is next of kin. And what we found in the Los Angeles Medical Examiner's office is that this is interpreted into a very complicated kind of tree, next of kin tree with 26 levels. And so they are, when they're calling in, they're notifying of a death and they're trying to find out who is going to claim this decedent. They're using these 26 boxes based on proximity to the deceased as to who they're going to ask. Friends, chosen family, alternative family forms are not in any of those 26 boxes. So what has to happen is that basically, in order to be a friend, a non-family member, you have to go to court. You have to sign an affidavit that says, I testify at risk of perjury that there's no family willing to take on this burden, and go through the legal system. And you can know in Los Angeles how that's going to mean right away that we're cutting out a significant, proportion of the population who maybe don't have the time or the kind of social capital to know how to navigate the legal system, right?
Or who are afraid to engage with the legal system.
Absolutely. Yeah. We definitely have in court cases, in probate court, seen people who started the process of filing, but then didn't show up at the hearing for very understandable reasons, right?
Well, and it's also a ludicrous proposition that a chosen family member would even know if there's next of kin. Like, it's sort of putting the onus on them to have done the work that the state should be doing. Like, if let's say that I'm living unhoused and I have a dear friend who dies, and then I realize, oh gosh, nothing is happening with this person. Like, they died here on the street. I saw that the, officials came and took them, but I haven't heard anything from anybody. And I sort of inquire and say, what's going to happen with this person's body? And they're like, I don't know, they're unclaimed. The state's going to just do what they're going to do. Why couldn't I then say, well, listen, I'm willing to pay. Let me take on that burden, right? Because how would I even know whether or not a family member was going to come forward? That's not my diligence to do.
Right. It's a complicated picture in the sense that there's more cases than the county can, they're just constantly dealing with a turnover of cases. They have a finite amount of space in the crypt, whether that's the morgue in the basement of General Hospital or the crypt and the medical examiners. And so they have a limited amount of space. So they're on a daily pressure. They've got more bodies coming in they've got to sign out a fairly equal number, right? So it's a system that has to depend on a certain kind of efficiency. And, in America, we love our lawsuits. So this is a system that also is factoring in the risk of being sued, right? If a family member, so the county is really concerned with, if we were to let somebody who's not family claim a body, and then later family steps up and maybe has a legal right or a legal, justification to go to court to sue the county. So that's part of the logic there, right? So this is the kind of bureaucratic side. And then what I think, you're getting at with the question, and I think it's a really good one, and it's one that I hope we'll have a wider conversation about, for a number of reasons in the country. But, oftentimes, a body is taken away, the chosen family, the friends know, but then they're cut out of the process. So they don't even know what's going on, right? If you think about, you have experience in a hospital, friends can't just call up and ask, hey, what's happening with my friend because of, HIPAA. So it's not the same. HIPAA is not applying here in the same way, but it's, oftentimes we would talk to friends and family who were like, we called in the death and then we never heard anything. We never heard what was going to happen.
What the way that the next of kin is being defined, it's based on the proximity within a genealogical tree, but it doesn't really take into consideration the quality of the relationship with the decedent. So what happens is then that some people who would be willing to organize a funeral are never asked, and others who have had bad relationships with the decedent are saddled with the responsibility of organizing a funeral, and they're not going to step up. And actually, the situation that you describe is one of the cases in our book. One of the 4 characters we follow, it's a woman who, Ines Gonzalez, who called herself Mitch and was known by her entire community as Mitch. And she was a woman who, if you would have met her, you would have seen, oh, this looks like a homeless woman living in her car with cats. Which was exactly what she was doing. But she was really deeply ingrained in a church community in Westchester next to the airport here at LAX. And, she organized summer camps for them. They counted on her. They gave her access to showers. And they eventually, at the end of her life, they even converted the garage of one of the church members for her to live in. And they brought her to dialysis consultations. So she was really ingrained in this community. And the church community, when she died, the church community was willing to organize a funeral, but the county found a remote relative that Mitch hadn't been in contact with in decades. And that person then had the responsibility of organizing a funeral. And so Mitch sort of fell between the gaps. The person in her home state of New Mexico didn't really want to organize the funeral, and the community that wanted to do it, they were not allowed to do it. So we see this indeed happening, that the quality of the relationship is not valued. It's just how close are you in a tree, and the tree is goes from box to box, like from child to parent to siblings, etc.
It's so funny because it's sort of it's almost like a reliance on a more communal ethic. Like the laws are based upon living in a society with or I guess I could say more of a family ethic, when that's not the norm anymore. Or maybe it's the norm, but it's definitely not the typical case. Yeah, it might be normative, but it's not reality. And so, Stefan, to stick with you for a minute, I was hoping that, there were a few things that Pamela mentioned that maybe you can help us paint a picture for us, especially given that you've spent so much of your career spending time in these places and doing research in these places. Can you maybe paint a picture for us of what the LA morgue is like, just in terms of volume? How many bodies are processed? How many people are dying here in the city or the county? Maybe a little bit on the logistics there, because I'm not sure we all have a good idea of the scale here.
Yeah, and so this will bring up another issue for anyone trying to claim, which is that the bureaucracy in LA County is quite convoluted, and there's overlapping agencies. So there's two main agencies that take care of dead bodies. One is the Office of the Medical Examiner, and they are called in when people die under suspicious circumstances, when they die suddenly and there is no doctor available to sign a death certificate. And the doctor needs to have seen the decedent within a certain time period before even being allowed to sign the death certificate. And so they go around the county every day and they pick up bodies. They do a scene investigation and they bring these bodies to their central facility. And by the way, from an existential point of view, these people have the worst job you can imagine. It's super hard. They never come into something really good. I mean, they're called for suicides, homicides, car accidents, sudden deaths of all kinds of age groups. So we have a tremendous respect for those people. So once they get into the medical examiner's office, the task is to identify the body, notify the next of kin, and determine the cause of death so that the death certificate can be filled out. And once they do this, then the body needs to be moving on because then they, like as Pamela said, they have a limited storage facility. Then there's another agency, which is the county morgue. And this is kind of unique in Los Angeles that those are separate. So the county morgue takes care of more routine deaths where there could be a doctor or where the person died in a hospital or a nursing home and they're well known and it's from natural causes.
Right. Or home on hospice, something like that.
Exactly.
Where there's at least documentation. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all of the sort of the non-suspicious deaths, the deaths that might have been expected. But again, there's not immediately a relative who's going to call a funeral home. And so in those cases, a third agency comes in, and the third agency also takes care of some of the medical examiner's cases. So there's a third agency involved, and that is the public administrator's office. And these people mainly look at the assets. And if the assets that the person leaves behind are under a certain threshold, then they're considered to be indigent. And if they're indigent and there's no relatives available, then the county will cremate the bodies. If they're indigent, if there's no family available, but they meet the threshold, then the county will organize a private funeral. So they will take money out of the assets and organize a private funeral. And we attended some of these funerals. They're the saddest events. I mean, that's truly heartbreaking because there's nobody there. So it's like these ornate caskets with flowers, and the only people there are the people who work in the cemetery. And there's this pro forma little ceremony that takes like 7 minutes, and then the person is put in the ground. And then to really round out the whole picture, veterans have the right to a burial in a national cemetery. So unclaimed veterans are not cremated, but they end up in Los Angeles County in a Riverside National Cemetery. It took us years to figure this all out because if you had to ask the county how many unclaimed are there, they only look at the cremation records. But in fact, there's all these other offshoots of like the private funerals and then the veterans. And so we had to put this all together.
Do you know, like on average, how many bodies a day each of these different, like let's say total, if you were to add everything up across all these different approaches, like how many people are dying in LA every day?
Well, so the Office of Deceased Affairs or the county morgue, we know, get about 11 bodies per day.
Okay.
So every day they've got 11 coming in. Some of them are from the hospitals and the nursing homes. So all of that together is 11 bodies a day. And the medical
examiner. That's across the county, you said, not the city?
Correct. That's across the county of Los Angeles, which is for people not familiar. Yeah. 10 million people, 4,000 square miles. It's huge, right?
It's huge. Yeah.
And so they rely on outsourcing quite a bit to just have vans to go and transport and pick up bodies. I don't think actually most Angelinos, I certainly didn't know until I started doing this. I don't think most people know that there's this whole kind of bureaucracy of vans around the city, around the county all the time um, uh, doing this. And then the county medical examiner, they have a crypt that holds about 540 bodies. So whatever's coming in, right? That's what I was saying. It has to come out. And we have the exact figures in the book. Stefan, do you remember they're dealing with there's about, let's just roughly say around 60,000 people a year in LA County who pass.
Okay.
And
Across
the medical
board.
the medical examiner handles about 10,000 cases of those. That doesn't mean they do autopsies or scene investigations of all of them. I can't.
Right.
Stefan, is about 4,000 a year. Am I right?
No, it's a little more, 6,000. But to just answer your question very snappily, it's about 5 to 6 people who go unclaimed every day in LA.
Just unclaimed. Okay. So that's
Yeah.
a subpopulation just of the actual
Yeah.
deaths. And how many,
Yes.
I think about, you mentioned the crypt, but then we also talked about the morgue. I've heard from people who have visited the morgue before that you just can't really fathom the scale until you go, that it feels like a warehouse full of bodies. Is that true?
It is true. It's there's like
Okay.
layers and layers and stacks of dead bodies wrapped in plastic.
Hmm. And that they're almost like organized by, you've got, the more decomp in one area or the newest ones in, or there's like a children's area, that it's actually quite difficult sometimes the first time you go. And it takes a while to get comfortable with that type of exposure.
Yes, and then actually there's another storage place. So the crematorium keeps the cremains of the unclaimed bodies for up to 3 years. And so there are going to be every year, Los Angeles County buries between 1,500 to 2,000 unclaimed people in a mass grave, the cremains of these people in a mass grave. So they keep about 6,000 little brown boxes with cremains on eight layers high. It's extraordinarily impressive. I mean, it's if you walk in there and you realize that every one of these boxes stacked next to each other, above each other, is a person. It's overwhelming. It's quite something.
Yeah, and I think that it probably really confronts you with the scale of, just population and density and what it means to be a human on the planet today. I think that those questions, which obviously are not the questions that we're grappling with today, but these questions of just like the sheer number, and is the system adequate? Is there enough burial space? Is it, good for the environment to be burning this many bodies? Just the sheer number, I think, is very kind of hard to wrap your head around.
Yes, and then also the reduction of a person into a couple of pounds of ashes in a box. That's also quite impressive. And then there are smaller boxes, like little envelopes almost, that have the remains of children and so, or babies or newborns. So it is quite, this the kind of things that only a few people see, but it's very impressive if you go behind the scenes and you see what is needed to manage this. That it's like an entire organization of vans, of crematoriums, of storing these remains, of investigations, of contacting relatives. That almost nobody sees. And it needs to be perfect. You do not want to send the wrong remains with the wrong person.
Right. You mentioned something I think that is a really important point here, as you said, not many people see this. And I know that as somebody who works in end of life, and many of the people I've interviewed on the show or that I've become friends with over the years in, let's say, thanatology or psychology or sociology, or even like I saw that you have a blurb from Caitlin Doty on the back of your book. So, and she's kind of a yeah, amazing funeral worker, mortician. I I know that my ethic, at least, and many of my peers' ethic, is that maybe death shouldn't be so much in the shadows, and we should be bringing this out and confronting it because it's such a normal part of the lived experience. And the more exposure we have to it, the less, kind of like existential dread or fear we might cripple us. Like the less kind of deep anxiety we might be carrying with us about death. It's sort of, it's a chicken and egg situation. Are we afraid of it because we don't ever talk about it? Or are we just like programmed to be afraid of it? And so I'm curious, this concept of the fact that we do almost intentionally as a society and as a governmental bureaucracy keep this hidden from view to sort of not upset the comfort of the citizens. How do you feel about that as a researcher who is constantly exposed to these confrontations?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably like a lot of Americans. I grew up, not talking about death with my parents, with my family. It's a subject that is very uncomfortable. You sort of, hide it away. You attend a funeral if someone's passed, and then you sort of are privately holding your grief as you continue on. And it's going to sound strange, and I hope listeners grant me the opportunity to explain this. I so appreciate having had the opportunity to do this book in that sense of waking me up to how important it is to talk about death, to think about death, not to, as Caitlin says, be afraid, but to really sort of not embrace death. That sounds strange and grim, but like to embrace the notion that there is value in talking about death as an awareness of our lives, right? Living life and mortality. Yeah.
It literally happens to everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's some billionaires who would like to change that, but,
right.
but they haven't succeeded yet, and I was thinking, as you were mentioning, Caitlin, like, the Order of the Good Death, they sell clothing, and I have one of their sweatshirts that says Future Corpse.
Right.
When I wear that, people stare. It just is a reminder to me how uncomfortable these topics are. And so I think about, again, like this sort of appreciation for coming to be aware of this. Now, I think it is unsettling, especially when we think about the number of baby boomers who are going to be, who are aging, who are approaching death. The numbers in this country are going to be rising. And so it's an uncomfortable topic for many. It's an uncomfortable, set of conversations to have. What do you want to have happen to your body when you're gone? But it's increasingly important if we really want to, kind of bring death out of the shadows, if you will, and to have conversations.
I think especially specifically with the unclaimed, by not talking about them, by rendering them invisible while they're alive, and then further rendering them invisible in death, we're also losing an opportunity to think about what's driving this rise in the number of unclaimed. And what we find is that there's a very strong element of family estrangement that doesn't necessarily register in official statistics like divorce would, but there, so many Americans are estranged from their close relatives. And the unclaimed show that, because there's this moment of the truth where a government official calls you up and says, "I've bad news, this person died." And then through the conversation asks, "Are you willing to organize a funeral? Or which funeral home are you going to use?" And if the person says, "No, I'm not going to do this," there's something behind that. That's like a big step from a cultural perspective, from a historical perspective, to decline to bury a relative. And what we find that's behind it is there's a lot of estrangement that just doesn't, people have, they're no longer supporting each other. From a formal perspective, they're still relatives, but in reality, they have given up a long time ago supporting each other and owing, stepping up at that critical moment. So, the paying attention to these kinds of deaths and deaths in general reflects back on life. It highlights something. And in that sense, the number of unclaimed is almost like a barometer of family relationships. It's like this extreme element. It captures something really extreme. And underneath is a whole set of social evolutions involving about the change in demographics of families and the kind of relationships we have, and maybe also some changes about what people feel they owe each other at the end of life.
Right. I'm curious. You mentioned that very often there is family, that are a next of kin is kind of found in these unclaimed scenarios, but they say, no, I'm not willing, or they refuse. Would you say it's more common that an unclaimed person has family who has refused, or is it also common that there is no family?
So this is one area where Los Angeles is kind of a best case scenario across the United States, because they have the bureaucracy is convoluted, but the benefit of the overlapping bureaucracy is that there are many government officials who are dedicated, right, in this instance, to finding next of kin, and they're utmost professionals. They're excellent at it. We tell a kind of institutional joke, if you will, that in the book about how they're even able to find Secret Service or secret agents.
I see. So like in other parts of the country, there may be next of kin, but there's just not the bandwidth to even be able to find them.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But I think in that sense, by knowing that they, I would say 3/4 of the time, they are able to locate a legal next of kin. And that in those moments, it is often family saying they're not willing to take on, that the ties withered decades earlier, years earlier. Money, of course, comes into all of this as well, right? Especially if you put it in conversation with the idea that people haven't been talking for many years. If you're suddenly called up by a county official saying you need to hire a private funeral home, you make some calls, that could be, $8,000 is the average in America, then, that's a significant expense to bear, especially if you haven't been close to that relative for some time. And so in that sense, other places in the country, death in America is a very local event. There are no federal agencies tracking the unclaimed, for example. And kind of giving us figures. So every place is a little bit different. But in this sense, I think Los Angeles helps us to really understand kind of the root causes of why somebody says, no, I'm not going to claim a relative. And that's, as Stefan said, is often estrangement.
And it's interesting, too, because this concept of unable to versus unwilling to is a wiggly line, right? Like there's not really a deeply clear distinction, and a lot of that is quite subjective, isn't it?
Yeah, no, from the medical examiner's office perspective, it's all abundant. Whether you have great reasons or bad, or you have bad reasons, or you're just taking the easy way out, for them that doesn't really matter. These bodies have been abandoned by the next of kin. But from our perspective, talking to these relatives, we can see where there's a lot of gray there. I mean, there's a sense of where people, indeed, these family ties have withered. Sometimes the decedent was abusive, and it feels like almost appropriate. It's like a punishment by letting them go unclaimed. In other cases, people are struggling. In other cases, people are overwhelmed with grief. But so the unable and unwilling is still a broad spectrum of kinds of motivations behind that. But whatever the reason is, you're basically creating a problem for government officials who have to deal with that body, and they cannot keep it indefinitely. So somebody has to take care of it at some point. And remember, there's every day new bodies come in. So they need to, whatever you can bring in, you need to bring out as well, or otherwise you get overrun with bodies. So the county is actually very generous in terms of being flexible with the amount of time they allow relatives. But at some point, it doesn't really matter what the reason behind it is. From their perspective, is we need to do something with this body.
Yeah, I just want to jump in for a second and just give folks a little bit of perspective. So Los Angeles, as we said, will give time. The law in California is 30 days after notification. Very often we find they give much longer.
30 days till what? Till they will cremate?
Sorry, 30 days after notification of a death to claim a body before it's classified by the county as abandoned or unclaimed.
And then what? And sorry to interject, but like, and then what happens? Then do they cremate it?
Yeah, so that goes back to whether or not they have assets.
Right. Right. Yeah, you explained. There's a decision tree then, but at that 30-day point, that's when they sort of start to.
Yeah. But often they're waiting. You know, if a family member immediately says, no, we're not going to claim. Okay, that makes it simpler for them. But often what we found is that people sort of stalled. They didn't respond to messages, or they kept trying to buy time, and you know, for a number of reasons, and the county would often give it to them. In other places, so again, like that's sort of, and then you know, they hold the ashes for 3 years, giving an opportunity if it was classified an indigent death for people to come by, and we find in about 15% of the time, people do have their ashes reclaimed after they've been cremated by the county. So that's sort of where LA, I think, does things in a really respectful manner. In other counties, it may be days. It may be at 30 days, you know, even 30 days, the body isn't cremated and the ashes are scattered at sea. There's a kind of finality to that, right? That you can't sort of undo. Now in Hart Island, the largest potter's field in America off of Manhattan, they are burying bodies, full bodies in mass graves. There are opportunities to exhume the bodies there. So again, that's to sort of show you there's this wide variation of what can happen and where LA kind of fits into the spectrum.
Is there any sort of like logistical, biomedical reason for these arbitrary time distinctions? Like, is there a certain amount of time that a body keeps? Or if you keep it on ice, can it be like indefinite?
No, I think that's much more driven by cost. You know,
Right.
basically, you store if you go to a funeral home and you store a body, actually, we looked into that. I don't remember exact numbers, but it was several hundreds of dollars a day storage fees. And so basically, the government is keeping these bodies in these huge crypts, and you know that it comes with an opportunity cost. But it's like, we talked to government officials in different counties, and they say our primary responsibility is not to the decedent or to the relatives, but to our taxpayers. And we're going to dispose of these bodies as cheaply as possible. And again, that changes the entire experience very differently. If you are from a culture where you need to have seen the body, pictures, or even ideally the actual body, and the ashes are spread at sea and there's no trace left behind, that's going to really affect the grieving you're going to go through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, there's something that kind of comes up for me as we have these conversations, and I'm constantly fighting against this internal part of me, the sort of ex-neuroscientist who is always trying to quantify things that are qualitative in nature. You know, it's like there's two halves of me that are always at war. But at risk of deeply oversimplifying a lot of the systemic issues with this country that I think can in some ways be exemplified by the stories that you tell in your book. How much does poverty, just the actual struggle of affording to live in a kind of capitalist society and not having the support or the resources that you need, play into this concept of the unclaimed? Clearly, there are always going to be examples where there are unclaimed bodies that were just like wealthy, eccentric, hermit type people, or just individuals who were really cut off from people in their lives. But is poverty not a massive variable that sort of contributes to the comorbidities of these people's lives and deaths?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to toss to Stefan because I know he'll add even richer notions. Yeah. So I really appreciate this question because it's one that I've been hoping would come out more as we talk to folks about the book. Poverty is absolutely a major part of this story. Maybe not exactly in the way I expected when I came into it, right? Often families, I was really surprised. They don't go to the cost as often as I would have thought as the justification for why they're not going to claim. But where poverty really matters is the strain it is putting on people in daily life, the strain on social relationships, right? We do not have a healthy, functioning social safety net in this country. And as a result, we expect families to do it all. We expect families to solve our housing crisis, our drug addiction and overdose crises. We expect them to solve the mental health crisis, right? Also, one of the stories we tell in the book is of, outliving your relatives or aging and living a really long life. And then your body is just at some point starts to break down and you need long-term care, right? You need full-time long-term care. There is an intentional gap in Medicare that doesn't allow people to have nursing home coverage paid for or subsidized by the government. You have to then qualify for Medicaid, which means you've spent down all your assets, right? So we tell the story of Lena Brown, who, had kind of, in the American way, done everything right and was living a middle-class life for much of her adulthood. She had a paid off house, Social Security, flush savings account. But once she needed full-time care in a nursing home within a couple of years, everything was spent down by healthcare costs and long-term facility costs. And she died penniless. So she died poor, but she hadn't lived poor. And so that's one of the ways that I would love us as a society to have a deeper conversation about what are we going to do as we face rising number of elders in our population. How are we going to care for them in light of the fact that we don't have this social safety net? So that's one of the ways that I see poverty as really central part of the story. And Stefan, I know you have more to add, I'm sure.
And before you do, Stefan, before you dive in, I'm so sorry. It just it reminds me, at risk of getting political, it just reminds me of this sort of axiom that I think so many of us here in America are just unwilling to face. And maybe it's because we've been sort of fed a lot of rhetoric to the contrary. But we are all a year away from being homeless. We are not a year away from having a billionaire status. And I think that that's something that very few people are willing to recognize in their own lives, that even if you're playing the game correctly, and doing all the things, and even if you had privilege, it's very easy to become destitute through no fault of your own, simply because you became ill or because you lost some sort of capability. But it's impossible to become, deeply wealthy in this country. We are much closer to that end of the spectrum. All of us are. So anyway, sorry to continue, Stefan.
Yeah, no, amen. Exactly.
Yeah. I just had to say it.
I would add that we're also all at risk of going unclaimed. It's not out of the question. This is what we learned from this research. And to come back to this issue of poverty. So if poverty so I completely agree with everything Pamela said, that poverty intersects at every level, and that this is like a systemic poverty issue. However, if poverty was the main reason why people would go unclaimed, we would expect the rates of unclaimed to be like 15 to 40%. And it's around 4% instead. So there are so many people who are struggling financially who do step up. So why are people claiming bodies of relatives if that brings them, it gives them an enormous financial setback? So
right, it puts
there's
them
something
deeper into
there.
poverty. Yeah,
there's a deeper cultural reason that we value burying our own. It's like a last way of doing family. We're sending a signal. This is the kind of people we are. We are the people who, in spite of poverty, we might be doing car washes, we might be selling a car, but we're going to bury our own. So it's not. I mean, there's an interaction between poverty and culture that goes in multiple ways. It's not just a question of money. It's also a question of what do you believe you owe your own? What do you believe you owe the debt?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's so interesting, this deeper ethic that, I struggle with this because I can very easily fall into a cynical mentality, but then I, can find these glimmering moments of hope and of kind of common humanity, I'm reminded of, I had a guest on the show. His name's Brad Mackay, Dr. Brad Mackay. He's a physician in in Australia. He's become a good friend of mine who writes about sort of medical pseudoscience. And he is, specializes in working with HIV/AIDS patients and LGBTQ patients in Australia. And we were kind of shooting the shit one day, and he sent me a message and he was like, okay, explain this to me about America, because this very much confuses me. I think he was watching a speech by Trump or something. And he was like, there's always going to be a percentage of the population, of the society, who like cannot contribute. Like they're too ill, or they're too mentally ill, or they had some sort of injury, or they are they have an intellectual disability, and they can't contribute, quote unquote, in the way that we think from a capitalist perspective. Like they can't pull their own weight, or however you want to word it. And he was like, what happens to those people? And I was like, oh, they're homeless. Like, this is our society, right? We don't have the safety nets that we think we should have. And so it's interesting that you mention that the Unclaimed in some ways is the epitome of that, but almost it forces a beautiful humanistic ethic that's weirdly not always there in life, but it somehow comes out in death.
Yes, and that's even, that's also then apparent in strangers who step up when family abandon their relatives. So this is one of the mind-blowing things of writing this book, is that there are these communities across the country of volunteers who take on this role of grieving people they have never met, strangers mourning strangers, coming to organizing ceremonies to bring a last element of dignity to people they don't really know anything about. And this actually is also one of the reasons why LA is such a fantastic place to look at the Unclaimed, because every year in December at Boyle Heights there's this big ceremony where community members are invited, and it's an interfaith ceremony. It's a multilingual ceremony, and people stand around a mass grave of between 1,500 to 2,000 cremains buried there in this little corner of Evergreen Cemetery. And they're and it's really touching. It's extraordinarily meaningful, because you do bring dignity. You do bring this last element of humanity. You couldn't be there for these people in life because maybe you didn't know them, but here you are, and you're still giving them that last send off.
Do you think, Stefan, that like kind of cultural or social or religious or ethnic, or, all the different kind of demographic variables you want to use to describe this, but cultural heterogeneity is actually a driving force for that ethic? Like the fact that there are so many just different types of people in LA that bring so many varied backgrounds. Do you think that helps or hurts in some ways the ethic of taking care of the dead, even if you don't know them?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought too much about it. Pamela, do you have a first take on this?
I mean, I would say, based on our experiences attending that ceremony every year since 2015, with the exception of COVID, when they had live streams only, just to sort of be around a diversity of people. And we point this out in the book. These are people who may never have interacted with one another in the county of Los Angeles, right? Coming together on this Wednesday morning, or Thursday morning, as it was more recently, and just talking with them. I think the heterogeneity is actually a driving force for many of them to show up, right? There's different reasons, maybe religious, it may be political, it may be kind of a demographic attachment to sort of thinking about who could be buried there, right? I'm thinking of stories of migration and migrants who are kind of coming together to sort of honor people who've also had a journey and had to restart a life, and just a sort of deep recognition and humanity about what that experience means, sort of thinking that reflecting on that is a possibility for one of the reasons somebody goes unclaimed. And so all these people coming together. And I think there's this moment, at the same time, there's this heterogeneity. There's also this kind of commitment, this unified ethos that we heard from people who attend, that I want to be here and I want to be around other people who feel the same way that I do. So we talked to a woman, Nicole, who had lost her brother years earlier, very tragically, had the case handled by the medical examiners. And, every year since then, she would come to the Boyle Heights ceremony to honor people that she felt could have been like her brother, could have been lonely. And while her brother didn't go unclaimed, she still felt that there was this connection and this concern, like, I wish I could have done more for my brother. I wish I could do more for humanity. I'm coming and I'm around other people who feel that same way. And
there's, sorry to interject, but there's a beauty. And again, I struggle with my cynicism here, and I'm always like grappling with the two. You see this so often when it comes to activism, or it comes to causes, or it just comes to like community engagement, is that something often isn't real until it happens to you. So you're marching in the streets against gun violence, or you're, marching in a pride parade even, and you often have a personal connection to it. And there's something almost like, obviously it's heartbreaking to think about the fact that an individual had to go through tragedy, and now they're sort of coming out on the other side, or their healing process is to say, I now recognize and have deep empathy for other people who are going through tragedy, and I want to be there to support them. But there's also that kind of cynicism of the people who, like, this applies to all of us. And sadly, until it happens to us, we often don't think about these things at all.
But what's really interesting also about this ceremony is that many people carry unresolved grief. And where do you go with this? And so transposing this on a ceremony of Unclaimed, it's probably one of the very few avenues where you can deal or take a bite size of this grief off and work through it. So indeed, there's a personal connection, but that's also what makes it personally meaningful for a lot of these attendees, is that they are there not just as a community, but also trying to work through some of these elements themselves. Are they on their way of going unclaimed, and what should they change something in their life? Do they have somebody who will claim them, or were they there for people that went unclaimed? So there's something, there's not that many avenues that we have, where we talked about earlier about this denial of death. There's not that many ways that you can just share this. And this is one of these ritualized ways of at least addressing some of that.
I just want to jump in for a second and say, I appreciate the cynicism. I definitely, as an academic, feel it, right? And certainly when I get on X, or, formerly known as Twitter, I definitely have that part of me fed, at least by the algorithm. I do think that after having worked on this book, what I sort of say to that, and what I say to myself really, is, you know what, in the end, I guess I don't really care anymore what is somebody's journey to get to the point of empathizing and to come and show up. Just the fact that they do, I'm going to hold on to that. And I feel that, we are, it's so hard to write about these things without sounding too sentimental or coming off as trite. And we had to work, especially at the ending of the book, quite many, many times we rewrote it. But it is true that we're stronger when we're together. We're better when we're doing this. Sociologists, a classic sociological notion of this idea of collective effervescence, right? So every day we're experiencing so much difference with each other. We need these moments of ritual where we come together and we have shared emotions across those differences. And however ephemeral that may be, it is really important for repairing tears to our social fabric. And I think one thing I've heard consistently over the years as I've given talks or I've spoken with people is that we don't have a lot of rituals left in America, at least rituals that haven't been incredibly politicized. So,
or rituals that are not deeply just like individualistic or personal. This idea of being able to, like, I'm an atheist, right? And so as a secular individual, I don't have a religious community. And because of that, I yeah, it would be hard for me to find these examples. And I think one thing that's so beautiful about this, as a now clinical psychologist, I work with people who are often dealing with grief. And we, you know, I don't take the kind of one size fits all approach to psychotherapy. Like it's very individualized. Each individual is going to approach their grief in a different way. But I often talk about the power and the value of ritual, and we might describe visiting grave sites or setting a place at the table for somebody on certain anniversaries. But I have never sort of quote unquote prescribed or recommended attending one of these ceremonies. And I think I might add that to the repertoire, because how incredibly meaningful, especially for somebody who's struggling with that concept of closure, which doesn't ever really exist. Somebody who's gone through something similar, or maybe they haven't gone through something similar, but they can heal through supporting others in that way. I love that. I feel like there's a million other things we could talk about. I've kept you guys over the hour. I don't know. There's something that felt very like closing there, but I'm curious, before we do start to sort of wrap it up, I want to ask each of you separately or individually. We've touched on a lot of things, but this is my way. I'm a little bit frenetic in how I approach books, because also, like, read the book, people. Like, the stories are there, and it's narrative nonfiction, which I love. It really takes you on this journey. You connect with these characters because they're real people. They're not, characters. Tell me, each of you, is there anything that we didn't get into thematically or specifically that you'd sort of be remiss that we end the interview without mentioning?
I love that question. I just have to say, I teach a lot of qualitative methods courses, and I tell all my students that should be the last question.
I always close with that question. That's funny. I can see my research. It's so weird moving into psychology from journalism, as you know so well, going into academia, how much like journalism made me a better, not just therapist, but a better qualitative researcher. But then learning qualitative research, I think, would have made me a better journalist.
Yeah, exactly. So I think one thing that just kind of comes to mind is just to sort of encourage people to come to the book with an open-mindedness that, you think what an unclaimed death is, if you've thought about it, right? I mean, often people will say, oh, you're writing about the unclaimed, so you're writing about the homeless. And just kind of come with an open mind and see that this is both a problem that's bigger than many of us have ever thought about, closer to home, I think, than most of us have thought about. But there really is this opportunity, I hope, to have a conversation. If you're unsettled by something in this book, what would you like to see different? What kind of care do you think we should be giving, not just in death, but to the living as well?
I love that. And Stefan, does anything come up for you that we didn't really, cover?
I would say exactly the same thing that Pamela just said. So, I mean, it's the unclaimed reflect back on the living, and it's that at the living that we need to pay more attention. So, I mean, she said it better than that. So I would just keep it there.
Well, gosh, it's been such a pleasure learning from the two of you, digging into this book. I really highly recommend it and hope that everybody, here on the show, a little something has been sparked in them. I think for many people, this is a topic they've never even thought about, as you mentioned. And so this is opening up a whole kind of world of inquiry and of kind of introspection and self-exploration. And for others who maybe have thought about it, there definitely are a lot of surprises. It's, the research shows it's not how you think it is. And so that's always, I think, important for our own personal growth and development. So I just want to thank you guys so much for being here and for sort of opening our eyes to this.
It was a great pleasure.
Oh, I'm so glad. So the book, everyone, is The Unclaimed: Abandonment and Hope in the City of Angels by Doctors Pamela Prickett and Stefan Timmermans. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.